Hey everyone, and welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, we're going to be discussing cyber resilience. We're going to be unpacking exactly what that means, and we're going to be pointing to some of the threats. Maybe you thought that they were coming further down the field, but some of the threats that are emerging today. We have a great guest on the show who's going to be talking through all of those things. Derrick Butts. Derrick is a cyber resilience strategist who spent nearly 8 years as the Chief Information and Cybersecurity Officer of Truth Initiative. And he's also held security roles at both the US Navy and Siemens, and nowadays can be found as the CEO and founder of Continuums Strategies, a cyber business transformation advisor, helping companies manage their cyber resilience as a predictable risk. Let's start the show. Hey Derrick, how you doing?
Good morning, Rafi. How's it going?
Good, really good, really good. Really good to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us. Looking forward to unpacking today's topic. But what we like to do every podcast is to ask our guests as an opening question, as a bit of an icebreaker, what was your first ever social media account, if you want to share with us?
First social media account. Now that takes me way back. I would have to say MySpace was probably the first one. When you go to look at different things as they were just starting to form after the bulletin boards were coming up. But I think that was my first account that I started getting into, and really I started getting more involved in the social media aspect of being online.
You still have that account? That's an account that you check regularly, I presume.
Absolutely.
Amazing. So one of the topics, or kind of a big topic that we were going to talk about, is cyber resilience, and I wanted to focus as much time on this topic as possible because it's a term that I think a lot of listeners might not be aware of, but also as well might not be kind of fully aware of the whole scope because it really encompasses lots of things. Just before I hit record, we were uncovering just some of those aspects. But maybe if it's helpful to start for people listening, what is cyber resilience?
So cyber resilience is a strategy. It really takes into account looking at customers and their security posture to see where they are with their security postures, looking at being prepared from a policy point of view, from a procedural point of view, from a technology and a people point of view. And that's important because it's really a mix. You can't just have one without the other. They all have to work together. And it's really getting the company positioned that if there should be a cyber attack or a cyber threat, do they have the resilience infrastructure or capability to recover from it, where they can get their data back and not have to worry about paying an adversary or an attacker a ransomware.
And you mentioned two words, and I'm not sure if you use them interchangeably, but I'd like to kind of go straight into that. You said a cyber attack or a cyber threat. What would be the difference between those two, or is there a difference?
They're kind of both. Usually, a threat is the emerging or the building of an attack. So, one of the things is adversaries are known to be in your network anywhere from 2 weeks to a month before they actually launch an attack. If they're
Mm.
setting up to prepare for an attack or an ambush of your network, the question is, do you have the capabilities, the threat intelligence tools to monitor that building and anomalies that are changing that are taking place in your infrastructure? That's going to be important. So, when you're looking at the threat aspect, when you see something that's not normal from your day-to-day activity, you really have to say, is this something I should need to check out, or is it something I can avoid or just not pay attention to?
Mm. And the nature of threats may have stayed the same, or in fact, they may have changed, but actually the location of those threats are also, and attacks might have also changed. Is that something you found, or where should people that are responsible day to day for looking for those threats, where should they be looking?
Well, it's the threats really, it depends on the industry. So as
Mm.
every company is different. When you look at today, over 80% of attacks still come from a phishing type of attack, where it's social engineering is a big aspect, where they try to get your credentials. So when you're looking at that, that's really looking at more the people aspect and what's the training that goes involving your people to recognize what's a phishing email, what's looking at how to monitor and look at those particular emails or messages that you get that may have a malicious link in it or may have a malicious attachment. Being able to recognize those is kind of the key, but that's part of the strategy because when you look at the way this is built, it's built in layers. You can't just have one layer and expect everything to work. You have to have multiple layers, and your last defense are going to be your people. So one of those things with it should get your initial defenses. Are your people prepared and trained to really recognize what a cyber attack or cyber threat looks like?
Mm. And okay, so how much does training? What's the kind of training that goes into? Say you've got a massive workforce. What does that training look like?
So it goes into security awareness. So security awareness is really going to be based on your industry, whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in textiles, whether you're in public services, or if you're working with government entities. Those all have different types of threats. They're going to have different type of attacks, and the adversaries are looking at your data or your intellectual property. And
Mm.
looking at that, you have to look at the training that has to be lined up and aligned with that particular threat for your industry. So if I'm doing that, I need to make sure I'm positioning my security awareness emails, my threat risk assessments, my training aspect to say this is going to be a realistic simulation of what they're going to see in the real world, and as close as possible. And being
Mm.
able to recognize those messages as they come through. You know, did you ask for that message? Is it somebody that says it coming from the company? How can you verify and validate it's actually that person who they say they are? The other thing is looking at what's the ask. The ask of the message may be for
Hmm.
something maybe out of the norm. In most cases, they're asking for an action. They may be asking for money. They may be asking for intellectual property. They may be asking for something that you're normally not familiar with, and you have to be prepared for that. The other thing is to really go back to validation and verification to really understand, um, is this person somebody that's part of my ecosystem I've ever dealt with before? Or why is this coming up now versus before? And why was I not given a heads up? So all these things kind of come into play to look at the chronological order of why the ask is being asked, but also what the demand is at the end. And is something can you really live up to, or do you really want to support without seeking the authority or just kind of verification from another source?
Mm, mm. And I think for most people, whether they're kind of day to day in this industry or watching it from afar, they would have a pretty good guess of the big macro changes and impacts. You know, hybrid workforce, working from home. You know, that's kind of a massive thing that's happened over the last few years or been accelerated. We're also a huge amount of conversation in terms of like ChatGPT. What are those big
Yes.
trends that you're seeing now that are impacting companies' abilities to be resilient?
Well, cyber resilience before the pandemic, most people were going into the office, and they infrastructure perimeter security was pretty much based on an office type setting. With now people being more of a hybrid workforce and working from home, and this is a global type of requirement, it doesn't matter where you are. So now I have to extend my security perimeters and my parameters out to the end point, which may be a person's living room, a person's home office, maybe a beach house, someplace outside of the norm, but it's not necessarily in the office, which means my attributes and my facilities and my capabilities need to extend, whether most of the services are cloud based, to look at those cloud elements to see um, how they're making the connections, how they're interacting, what are they actually transitioning.
Mm,
Also look at this fact of where they may be located. Is a visibility area that has high threats, and are they working through a VPN or some sort of security channel that I can better protect my data and infrastructure and access to my kingdom? The other thing is to look at how they're verifying and validating their access to their different services. When you go into a zero trust type format, having the proper zero trust tools in place to allow them to verify and validate and re-authenticate to make sure they still have the right person, they're still making the proper connections, and they're still authorized to have access to that information no matter where it may be. So when you look at this from a holistic and a global sense, you really have to pay attention to all those different aspects of where the people may be, where they may have access to information, who may be around them as far as the threats around them. And then basically when the connection is severed and reestablished, is it still the same person? That's another connection you have to worry about. So this goes back into the zero trust and the reauthentication and the validation of going moving forward.
and so I'd imagine most companies are not completely cyber resilient, which is why there are people like you in this world to help them do so. Um, but many of those challenges, hybrid working, people working from home, and all of those risks are kind of the challenges, at least in terms of awareness of the challenge, is kind of yesterday and today's. What are those challenges? What are the challenges for today and tomorrow? What are the things that people who are paid and are responsible for thinking of risks across the company from wherever it may be, what are those things that they should be thinking about that's coming down the line tomorrow that you might have visibility on?
Great question. So the reality is COVID had people really kind of take a step back and look at where they were in the ability to work remotely. Um, the remote aspect was only one piece of it, but the resilient factor is another. So now that I'm looking at this, the question is, people are always looking at, depending on the industry, can I be a victim of a cyber attack or ransomware attack? And then you have others that really kind of put it off because they don't think it may happen to them. Unfortunately, it can happen to anybody. And what we try to do is work with those companies and meet them where they are to figure out what the security technologies they have in place. Are they working towards a zero structure type infrastructure? Do they still have on-prem tools or data center they're working with? Are most of their services in the cloud? Their hybrid workforce, how many people are coming in the office versus not? But also look at what policies and procedures that you have in place. Business continuity is a huge factor as far as looking at your industry, any industry across the board. And if you don't have a business continuity plan that's in place and it's up to date, that you can say, if something should happen, whether it's like the pandemic, or whether it's a natural disaster or an accident that takes place or power outage, a tsunami, whatever the case may be, if you don't have a business continuity plan to plan for those particular anomalies, you're not going to be able to recover well. The other thing is, if you do have a plan in place, how often are you testing that plan to make sure it still works? This goes back to the reliable, if I have my data in one location and I have a business continuity or disaster recovery site in another location, when's the last time I've tested this? And a very important aspect of this and this resilience is really getting your senior management on board. When you look at the boards, your CEO, your senior leadership across the board, the question is, are they prepared and are they understand the impact of cyber resilience? Because it is a ripple effect. When you look at an attack that may take place coming in through one of your people clicking on a link, it may come in through your HR group, it may come in through your research group, but it's going to affect the entire company. So when you look at the ripple effect of change, you really have to understand, am I prepared to deal with that? Now, going back to your defenses, my infrastructure, my threat intelligence monitoring tools, my security services, as far as coming in through my firewalls, my VPN, what kind of scrubbing and visibility do I have, not only outside the network, but also inside the network? Am I able to track those different anomalies that are taking place? If I have somebody downloaded a lot of content at one time, is that going to give me a flag? If it gives me a flag, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to quarantine it? Or am I going to put it in someplace, a box that I can actually analyze it before I can send it back to that prospective owner? And then the other thing is looking at, again, the training of your employees. When you look at the resilience factor, the security awareness training is a huge component because you may have 4 or 5 layers before it gets to the actual end user. And your end user is going to be your weakest link or your last line of defense. And if they're not properly trained to understand how to recognize and deal, or take something that they think is suspicious and just send it to somebody who can analyze it, then you're not going to have the capability of having that resilience really being high resilience, or what I call a strong mature security posture, because that's going to be important as far as dealing with those threats that come through. But it goes back to the first step is, one, if you're an executive, recognize you do have an issue or have something you need to get checked out because you're not comfortable. And 2, taking those steps to make sure you're moving forward to get yourself in a situation sooner rather than later. One of the things I like to work with my customers on is really, when it comes to an adversary, you're playing chess and not checkers. An
Mm.
adversary is going to be your attacker and they're going to make a move. But ideally, you want to be prepared before they make that move, because if they make their move and you're not prepared for it, it may be too late. In the game of chess, you're really thinking 2 or 3 moves ahead of that adversary and how to prepare for their attack if they should attack. And when it does happen, what's your strategy moving forward?
Mm. That's a really comprehensive answer to the question, and I think is really kind of covers a lot of the bases. There are a lot of things that you spoke about just now that occurred to me that, when you talk about business continuity, on-prem, remote solutions, constantly testing, those sound like uh, processes and responses that suit large companies, that companies that have the resources to do so. But as we know, most of the workforce, most employees work for smaller companies.
Yes.
And so what can smaller companies do as well? Smaller and medium sized businesses.
So smaller companies, they may not have the skill set of a CIO or CISO to help them with their cyber resilience or their security strategies. So work with a consultant to kind of help them get that position, because a lot of times, more of the smaller companies, they're really either, especially the startups, they're really trying to figure out not only their funding, but how they're going to present their business to the world so they can get people to come in to buy their products. They need to look at how they're building their infrastructure and their security practice. And even as a small company, just like the large companies, you still need to have a business continuity plan in place. If something should happen to your network, your infrastructure, your intellectual property, or your data, the question is, how is it going to affect your brand? How's it going to affect your operations? And most of all, how is it going to affect your overall security? All these are risk factors that they need to look at, no matter the size of your company. And it's
Mm.
really important they look at it like that and they say, well, I'm too small to have this. You're not too small for an adversary to attack you. They don't really care. What they're really looking at, what's your intellectual property? And if you get a hold of that intellectual property, are you willing to pay to get it back? So it
Mm.
really comes down to data and money. And most of the time, in some cases, it may be just malicious. They're just looking to affect your brand. So when you're looking at from that perspective and the resilience aspect of it, how far will you go to protect your name? How far will you go to protect your company and protect your people?
Amazing. I think for a lot of people listening, they're going to be focused on threats that are coming from, or potential threats, mapping those out that are coming from the online space, open source platforms. What are the kinds of things that they should be thinking about, or what have you seen out there in terms of the online world?
So if you look at the threats, so if you're working with developers of any sort, they work with a lot of APIs. APIs are some of the largest threats that are out there. So you mentioned the open source type services. Because they're using a lot of open source APIs and they're actually integrating them to their products, if they're not looking at and verifying the validity and the integrity of those APIs, then they put themselves at risk.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, now it actually opens up another door because now it can infiltrate the rest of their infrastructure and all the connections they have, which means their customers and endpoints. And you really need to look at those particular aspects as far as when I'm dealing with industry on a global perspective. I need to contain that's the attack surface. And that attack surface being your particular people, your technologies, your devices, all those coming into play. And the APIs is just one piece of it. The other thing companies need to look at also, depending on your industry, no matter what size, is if your product's something that people are looking at and they really want to get. And if it gets disrupted, how will that interrupt you? So things that looking at the dark web to see how your name is being used or any particular information that may be shared with other people because you can buy it now. The other thing to look at from an international perspective is bot technology, and people. You can pretty much buy a bot attack for as low as $5, and believe it or not, you can scale from there. So you can have anywhere from 50 bots to 500 bots to attack and do what we call a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service, which is going to attack your website or attack your particular place of business. All these things come into the realm of preparing for the business continuity aspect, your cyber resilience aspect, but also looking at all these particular threats and where they may possibly come from. You need to prepare. And like I said, the size of the business doesn't really matter because in some form or fashion, you still need to prepare no matter what your size may be.
Yeah, although I think the challenges are very much different, like you mentioned. But you've mapped those out, the kind of challenges for larger companies, but also smaller companies and the kind of approaches. But you mentioned the international aspect of it. For larger companies, that's also the way that they're thinking. They're not just thinking in terms of their domestic territory; they're thinking across borders and the attacks that can be coming elsewhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's important because as you're a global entity, and we look at business now as being global, not just limited to certain countries, depending on your product, you really have to look at the enterprise aspect of what it may be. And like I said, you may be a small company, but your customers may be global, and you need to treat your infrastructure as if it's a global conglomerate and protect it as such. And you get into other regulations that may exist with different countries and different compliances you have to work with. Those are things that are also important to make sure you understand and track, and the threats that are going to exist in those different countries in which you're trying to do business. All that becomes a ripple effect of change in how you're doing your business and how you're rolling out your business. And also how you're going to sustain your business moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. I read out some of your experiences that you've had earlier at the beginning of the podcast. Really interesting, a wide range of things. What are the kind of key lessons, maybe to take you back to earlier in your career? What are some of the key lessons that you learned from coming up and gaining those experiences?
Actually, goes back to business continuity. One of my first jobs out of college was actually working with a Navy command, and I was doing work on submarines and surface crafts, and we were doing testing. And one of the things that was important was when you're out in the middle of a sea, at the middle of nowhere, you can't run to the store to get parts. So the business continuity aspect and thinking ahead, what can I do if I should have an issue or a glitch? I need to make sure I have systems that are backed up. I make sure I need to have systems that are fully available, but most of all, I need to make sure I have systems that are reliable. So when I look at this, is really looking at the proactive approach. When businesses, no matter your size, looking at this, can I be more proactive in looking at my my cyber resilience and my security posture? The proactive piece of it goes back to the chess-like mindset that I mentioned earlier, because you really have to be thinking ahead. Unfortunately, there's a lot of customers or people and businesses out there that really don't think it's going to happen to them or think they have more time.
Mm.
I would be great if they did, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. So my lesson learned is always be ready. When you're looking to prepare yourself, no matter what the aspect may be, is really to say, am I comfortable with the security technologies I have in place? Am I comfortable with the policies I have in place? Am I comfortable with the training of my people that I have as far as the technology I rolled out? And when's the last time I've tested to make sure that I'm really ready? Um, Being proactive versus reactive is really going to get customers to be more comfortable, to be more capable, to continue that revenue generation, continue to gain market share, to continue to grow, and not have to worry about these things bringing you back. And I think if you can be proactive and wherever possible, and I understand being proactive sometimes goes back to having the resources and the funding, but if you can in any way possible, at least try to get some sort of resiliency in place.
Wise words, and submarine seems like a good place to get your training in the best possible way. And I'd imagine it's a hard place to be able to just turn systems off and on if you need to.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Amazing. Is there anything else on this topic that you want to kind of cover off before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, just to make sure is if people aren't already start asking themselves the question, where do they stand with their cyber resilience? Where do they stand with their security posture? And the other question is, if you're not an executive listening to this and you have an industry, you're in a business, go to your executive and ask them that question. Where do we stand? Where are you, or when are you going to start investing into our resilience and our cybersecurity posture? Those are the questions they should be asking throughout all the industries. Again, it really doesn't matter the size because you can always make it better. Remember, emerging cyber threats, things like the phishing attacks are getting better. They're getting more creative because of things like ChatGPT and the chatbots that are out there, because now they can remove the grammar and the misspelled words and the other things and make it look like a professor wrote these messages. So when you look at those type of threats and the way they're evolving across the time, is really looking at the question you ask yourself: are we ready? Are we ready for the next cyber attack? Are we prepared to recover if we should be breached? Those are the questions that people should be asking in their industry. And if not, who can we go to actually get that out? It's like either a cybersecurity officer, a CISO, or somebody like a cyber resilience officer like myself, or an advisor, to kind of help them to kind of navigate where they may be. And the key thing is to find somebody that's going to help meet you where you are, because everybody's going to be at a different place when it comes to the cyber resilience journey.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the hardest question of all is, I would like you to share one example, as we do with every single guest that comes onto the show, one example of something good, something bad, and something fake that you're seeing in the online world now.
Good, bad, and fake. I think the good thing is there are a lot of credible sites. I know in the U.S. there's places like the Cybersecurity Information Security Agency. Those places, they list vulnerabilities and threats as they come out. So companies can actually go to see what particular threats may be existing based on the information or the platforms that they're using, whether it's cloud-based applications or services. And they can see, if I have these particular things in my business, what are the threats that are out there today? If they're not currently patching, they need to be patching. As far as the bad thing, there's a lot of misinformation that's out there too. I mean, there are people, I want to go back to zero trust. People think if they implement things like multi-factor authentication, they now have zero trust. Unfortunately, that's a misnomer, and that's a bad thing for people to think that, because the multi-factor authentication is only one layer of a zero trust type architecture. And you look at the fake things. Fake things is a hard one. I mean, there's misinformation or things that are not true. I don't know. You stumped me on that one. I'll try to figure out.
No,
Because
really.
there's a lot of bad information out there, but as far as verifying what's fake and what's real is also key, in making sure you have the services and capabilities to do that. I think that would be a key thing to understand what's fake in the industry, and there are different aspects you can actually go to help you verify and validate those particular sources.
Fantastic. And you mentioned one website, and if you're happy to share a couple of those other websites, we'll include the links in the show notes as well. So people can find the links, and then they can find and easily navigate towards those resources. Derrick, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time that you took out to kind of go through this topic and unpack it with us. Thank you so much for your time. And have a great day.
Thank you very much, Rafi.
Take care.
You too.